Joan Crawford spent a lifetime crafting the image of the perfect, doting mother. But her final act was a legal execution that left her eldest children with exactly $0 and a chilling 6-word message. Today, we are revealing the secret buried in Joan's will that changed the Crawford legacy forever. When the Golden Age icon passed away in her Manhattan apartment on May 10, 1977, the world mourned a legend. But behind closed doors, a brutal, calculated strike from beyond the grave was about to detonate. This was not a simple oversight or a mother's fleeting moment of anger. This was a masterclass in posthumous revenge, a meticulously engineered final curtain call designed to obliterate the lives of her 2 oldest children. To understand the sheer magnitude of this betrayal, we have to travel back to the meticulously manufactured world of mid-century Hollywood. During the 1930s and 1940s, Joan Crawford was not just a movie star. She was a one-woman industry, a titan of the silver screen who clawed her way up from absolute poverty to become Hollywood's ultimate survivor. She was box office gold, winning an Academy Award for her performance in Mildred Pierce, ironically playing a mother who sacrifices everything for an ungrateful daughter. But off-screen, there was one role she desperately needed to cast to complete her public persona: the role of the benevolent, selfless mother. Because she was unable to have biological children, she turned to the controversial black market adoption rings of the era, bypassing standard legal channels to acquire her first child, a baby girl she named Christina, followed shortly by a boy named Christopher. These children were instantly weaponized for publicity. Joan staged endless photo shoots with them in matching, pristine outfits, using their cherubic faces to soften her hardened, aggressive image in the press. The public believed they were witnessing the ultimate fairy tale, a wealthy, glamorous superstar showering her lucky orphans with a life of unimaginable luxury. But the reality of the Crawford household was a chilling paradox of extravagant wealth and militant, terrifying discipline, setting the stage for a family rupture that would eventually echo through the halls of a probate court and alter pop culture history. As Christina and Christopher grew from prop babies into autonomous teenagers, the cracks in the Crawford facade began to splinter violently. Joan demanded absolute perfection, and when her eldest children began to demonstrate normal adolescent rebellion, she viewed it not as a phase, but as a direct, treasonous assault on her brand. Christina, in particular, inherited her mother's fierce independence, leading to explosive confrontations that went far beyond typical mother-daughter arguments. Joan's punishments were psychological warfare, designed to strip away their dignity and remind them that everything they had was entirely conditional. Christopher struggled deeply with the oppressive environment, running away from school and eventually drifting out of his mother's orbit entirely. But let us look at 3 distinct examples of how Joan systematically dismantled their lives long before the will was ever read. First, there was the intense financial manipulation. Despite her vast wealth, Joan routinely forced Christina to pay for her own schooling and living expenses out of meager allowances, demanding receipts for basic necessities to maintain total economic control. Second, she orchestrated brutal public humiliations, like famously taking over Christina's acting role on the soap opera The Secret Storm when Christina was hospitalized. This was a blatant sabotage of her daughter's fledgling career, masked as a maternal favor, an act so bizarre it stunned television audiences and executives alike. Third, she initiated a complete emotional freeze-out in her final years. As Joan secluded herself in her New York apartment, drinking heavily and hiding her aging face from the paparazzi, she completely severed all communication with Christina and Christopher. She refused their phone calls, changed her unlisted numbers, and returned their desperate letters completely unopened. This wasn't just a drifting apart of adults. This was a deliberate, methodical erasure of her eldest children from her reality, a cold, calculated freeze that laid the psychological groundwork for the ultimate final blow that was secretly waiting for them in a lawyer's filing cabinet. But right here is where the story takes a massive, shocking turn. For decades, pop culture has believed a complete lie about this famous disinheritance. Everyone assumes Joan cut them out of the will because Christina wrote the explosive, career-destroying book Mommie Dearest. But that is chronologically impossible. Mommie Dearest was not published until a year after Joan died. Joan had absolutely no idea the book was being written, and she certainly never read a single page of it. The real secret behind the $0 inheritance wasn't a desperate, angry reaction to a tell-all memoir. It was a cold, premeditated legal trap that Joan set entirely on her own, a trap that ironically served as the catalyst that gave birth to the book in the first place. The genius of Joan's cruelty was in its precise legal execution. When a wealthy parent wants to disinherit a child, the biggest risk they face in a probate court is the child stepping forward to claim they were simply forgotten. If a child is omitted from a will entirely, without mention, a judge might easily rule that the parent experienced a lapse in memory due to advanced age or illness, and the court will subsequently award the child a mandatory, statutory portion of the estate. Joan and her high-powered attorneys knew this loophole perfectly. To ensure Christina and Christopher would never see a single dime of her $2 million fortune, she could not just ignore them. She had to explicitly, legally acknowledge their existence and then actively, unmistakably execute them from the document. This is where the infamous 6 words come into play. In the final draft of her will, signed in October 1976, just months before her death, Joan left $80,000 to her 2 youngest adopted daughters, the twins Cindy and Kathy, and distributed the rest of her vast wealth to various charities including the American Cancer Society and the American Heart Association. And then came the devastating clause. She dictated, "It is my intention to make no provision herein for my son, Christopher, or my daughter, Christina, for reasons which are well known to them." For reasons which are well known to them. Those 6 chilling words at the end of the sentence were a masterstroke of psychological torment and legal armor. It communicated to the surrogate court that she was completely of sound mind, that she remembered exactly who her children were, and that her decision to leave them penniless was intentional, rational, and justified. But far more devastatingly, it was a final, unanswerable insult from the grave. By stating the reasons were well known to them, she forced her children to carry the heavy burden of the blame in the public eye, while permanently silencing herself so they could never argue back, explain themselves, or seek closure. To truly grasp the magnitude of this legal maneuver, we must deeply analyze the exact mechanics of what happened next in the courts. Upon Joan's death, her estate was valued at roughly $2 million, which translates to well over $10 million in today's money. When the will was officially read, and the devastating clause was revealed to the public, Christina and Christopher were immediately thrown into a complex legal battlefield. They instantly realized that their mother's final testament was constructed like an ironclad fortress. However, they refused to walk away quietly and take the humiliation lying down. They initiated a high-stakes lawsuit against the estate, arguing that Joan was not of sound mind when she signed the document. They built a case claiming she was heavily medicated, isolated from reality, and under the undue influence of her lawyers and managers who sought to curry favor with the charitable organizations. They sought to invalidate the 1976 will and reinstate an earlier, older will from the late 1960s, which did actually include them in the inheritance. The legal reality of contesting a will with such specific exclusionary language is an absolute nightmare. The burden of proof falls entirely on the disinherited children to prove mental incompetence. This requires subpoenaing confidential medical records, deposing reluctant witnesses, and dragging the family's darkest, most shameful secrets out into public court records. The executors of Joan's estate quickly realized that a prolonged, ugly public trial would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and permanently destroy whatever was left of Joan's philanthropic legacy. The charities wanted their money, and they did not want it tied up in a decade of scandalous litigation. So, after a bitter, grueling 2-year legal standoff that exhausted both sides, a settlement was finally reached behind closed doors, proving that even the most perfect legal trap has its vulnerabilities. The fallout of the Crawford estate settlement remains one of the most fascinating case studies in Hollywood legal history and estate planning. Christina and Christopher eventually settled for $55,000 each. It was a mere fraction of the total estate, essentially equivalent to nuisance money, but it was enough to close the matter permanently and allow the charities to collect their windfalls. This exact scenario has served as a cautionary tale for high-net-worth estate planners ever since, demonstrating the delicate balance between disinheritance and inciting a legal war. Look at the subsequent cases of celebrity disinheritance that followed this exact blueprint in the years to come. When the legendary crooner Bing Crosby passed away, he famously locked away the inheritance of his eldest sons in a restrictive blind trust they could not access until they reached the age of 65, essentially disinheriting their youth and punishing them for their perceived wild behavior. When Bette Davis, Joan's legendary and bitter cinematic rival, passed away over a decade later, she explicitly disinherited her own daughter B.D. Hyman, who had also written a scathing tell-all book. Bette Davis used almost the exact same legal tactic of specific, undeniable exclusion to prevent any court challenges, clearly having learned from the media circus surrounding the Crawford estate. The Crawford settlement proved that even the most meticulously drafted exclusionary clauses can be vulnerable to lawsuits if the estate executors are afraid of bad press. However, Joan's maneuver ultimately achieved its primary goal. She dictated the terms of her legacy, tightly controlled the distribution of her wealth, and maintained her tyrannical grip on her family dynamics long after the life had left her body. In the end, Joan Crawford's attempt to have the final, definitive word backfired in a way she could never have possibly calculated. Her chilling 6-word dismissal did not silence her children, it radicalized them. It violently severed the absolute last thread of familial loyalty Christina felt, giving her the ultimate moral permission to rush the publication of Mommie Dearest and obliterate the Crawford myth forever. Joan tried to control her legacy with impenetrable legal paperwork and financial starvation, but she vastly underestimated the terrifying power of a child who has been given nothing, and therefore has absolutely nothing left to lose. And if you are fascinated by the dark psychology behind Hollywood's most notorious family feuds, you need to hear exactly what happened when Bette Davis executed her own version of ultimate revenge from the grave. Up next.